God had told him to leave his family and leave his land, leave everything he knows, and go to a land that he knew nothing about. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever had to move away from everything that you knew to go to a totally different place where you knew nobody and lived in a tent? Abraham never had a house. You know, sometimes we think, oh, I'll be happy if I own my own home. Boy, if I just have my own home, I'll be so happy one day. Abraham never had a house. Abraham was living as a nomad. He wandered, and yet God blessed him. And he was doing what God wanted him to do. We're going to find where he has an encounter with angels. There's a lot that we can learn about this. Abraham did not have an established home location, which was very standard for somebody in his life. And he was a shepherd living in what would later be called Israel. That's where his descendants are, both the Arabs and the Jews. And they came from him. They've always been there. Both groups of them have always been there over the years. Some were deported by the Romans, both Arabs, both Jews. They were deported by different people, killed, persecuted, and the conflict between them continues today. Abraham was promised a descendant that would bless the world. And before we continue, we're going to have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, as I go through this message this morning, I pray that you'll guard and guide the words that I say and speak to each heart. Each one of us were impacted by Abraham in some way, and help us to see the encounter that he had and what we can learn from it. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. As a background, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 18, by the way, if you want to turn there. It's back first book in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 18. But just to give you a little background, Abraham and his wife, actually he was originally called Abram, and his wife was Sarai. After God fulfilled the promise to him, he became Abraham, and she became Sarah. But Abram and Sarai were old and had no children. Back in Genesis chapter 16, in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children." So at this point, God had promised Abraham he's going to have a son, but now they're getting old, and they have no children. And so Sarah came up with an idea. Well, I'm too old now to have kids, so why don't I give you Hagar? And we looked at that. That's not Hagar the Horrible, the Viking from the cartoon strips. Any of you remember Hagar the Horrible? You've got to be older to remember that one. Yeah, I always liked that one. Of course, being Norwegian, that was fun. But we looked at this person, and it said in chapter 16, verse 1, that she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So that was this handmaid of Sarah, and they decided to take things into your own hand. And so it says, and Sarah said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. That's true. God didn't let him have any kids yet. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. So she's looking at having a proxy here. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So they came up with a solution that they would take matters into their own hands. And so Sarah gave Abram her maid Hagar. And we looked at this in a previous message. Hagar conceived. Hagar was treated harshly. She fled. She goes out into the desert. And the angel of the Lord appeared to her. The very first mention of the angel of the Lord, of God taking on an angelic form, and he appears. It's called a theophany. That's when God appears before Jesus comes. So he comes, and he promised her some special descendants. He particularly said about them, in verse 11, the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So, Hagar's going to have a son, and all the descendants are going to be contentious. Well, if you study history and you look at it, this certainly became true, and it's true today. Hamas, Hezbollah, they're all descendants of Ishmael. And this is a result of actually Ishmael, or one of Abraham's other sons. He actually had more than Isaac. After that, he had another handmaid, and she had a bunch. And all of those people, they're descendants of Abraham, and there was contention. So here we have, that's all taken place, okay? So Ishmael's born, but he's not the promised one. And the promised one has not come yet. And they're just getting older. Now, Genesis chapter 18, we find Abraham has an encounter with angels. And I think it's important to look at this. So we're going to read start in chapter 18, verse 1. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on. For therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do, as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened unto the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, and well stricken in age. And it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee, according to that time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abram the thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. So, what goes on here? First off, we see that Abraham encountered what he called 3 men. He saw 3 men. It tells us he was resting in the door of his tent in the heat of the day. If you've ever been into some of these hot countries, people don't work from like noon to 2 or 3. In the South, in South America, they have siesta, they refer to it as. It's too hot to go outside and do something. And this is very true in the Middle East or near the equator. It's very hot there. And so he's sitting there, and this is not the time for people to work or travel, but now he sees 3 people. And it says, suddenly he looked and he saw near him 3 men. That's the word he used to describe them. He sees 3 men near him. And all 3 appeared to be human. If you ask people, what do you think of when you think of angels? Most people think of one of 2 things, usually. The angels on the hillside appearing to the shepherds, or the angel appearing to Mary and Joseph. That's usually what they think. Usually it's the angels at Christmas time, and all those angels have wings, right? They all have wings. I have a set of those wings. My father was with NBC. He did made-for-TV movies, and they did a movie called The Little Angel, and they had these wings, and they would throw the props away afterwards, so we brought some of those home. We used to use them in our school plays. So even though you don't see my wings, I have wings. No. But when people picture angels, that's what they picture. they look amazing, right? They're wearing like super clean clothes and bright and shining. It's like when they made the first movies about Jesus, like The Greatest Story Ever Told. If you watch those, Jesus glows. Now, if that was true, when the Pharisees and Sadducees wanted to kill Jesus, they wouldn't have had to pay Judas. It's at nighttime. Just go get the guy who glows, right? They didn't do that. Jesus didn't glow. And these angels, they look just like men. They look just like men. And he sees these, but one of them was clearly the Lord. So, whoa, this is not what people would expect. Here's 3 men. 2 of them are angels. 1 is Jesus. But they look just like human beings. So they come up to him, and he extends hospitality to them. In Hebrews chapter 13, it tells us, very interesting, like thrown in the middle of another whole discussion. Right in the middle of this discussion in Hebrews chapter 13, it tells us these words. Let's get to Hebrews 13. In Hebrews 13, in verse 2, it says, remember them that are, be not forgetful to entertain strangers. Now, by entertain, it doesn't mean put on a show. It's not like, and now, here we are. We're going to sing for you. We're going to dance. To entertain means to have them as a guest or whatever, to treat them well. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Now, Abraham right away knows there's something different when he has conversation with these. But the Bible tells us it's very possible you have encountered angels and didn't know it. And usually they would be strangers. It won't be someone you know, because people don't become angels. We already looked at that. The Bible doesn't teach that. No religion teaches that except Mormonism. No one. There's no such thing. Angels are different than human beings. They're not the same. And humans don't become angels. They might be angelic in your mind of what an angel is. Hopefully not the Lucifer type, right? I've met that kind. But it says here, some have entertained angels unaware. So he extends hospitality. It says he ran to meet them. So they're kind of like walking by, and he runs out to where they are. A lot of people don't do that. It's like, oh no, here comes company. What do we do? And it says he bowed. And the word for bow there's a couple words for bow that were used in the Bible and in the Middle East. And if you met someone who was your equal, you would do one of these, just a little bit like that. That actually applies in a country like Korea, Japan, China. You're supposed to, you kind of bow just a little. And the depth of the bow indicates the depth of respect. This word bow means like got down on his knees. This is like, whoa, this is really extreme. This is like an extreme honoring. It's pretty much it's a sign of reverence and worship. So even though there's 3 men, Abraham knows there's something different about them. And not only that, he calls himself your servant. So he recognizes that something in these men have something, they're connected to who he's serving. He's willing to worship, and he already knows the Bible says don't worship anybody but God. And then he offered them rest and food. Some people say, angels don't eat. Angels don't eat. Then how come heaven has trees with fruit on it? Okay, and it says, well, in heaven you'll never be hungry. That doesn't mean you don't eat. In heaven you'll never be tired. It doesn't mean you don't sleep. It just means you're not going to be tired out, and you're not going to be hungry. In fact, God said, come eat of the fruit freely. He describes that in heaven. So here we have God and 2 angels with Abraham resting under a tree in the shade. And he prepares them food, pretty good food too. He gets a young calf. They're the ones that taste better. It's more tender. The interesting thing is in verse 5, when he offers this to them, it says, and they said, Hayama. Right? No. It's interesting today that there are certain churches where you'll go into church and that happens. Someone will get up and all of a sudden you're going to hear, whoa, what in the world is that? And sometimes somebody else might say what it was, and other times they don't. If you walk up to someone after, you say, what was that? And they'll tell you, I just spoke in an angelic language. That's what they'll tell you. And they take it from 1 Corinthians when it says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, it profits me nothing. And they say, see, there's a difference between the way men and angels talk. Well, you certainly are misinterpreting that passage. They are. First off, no one, no church, no theology ever in the world ever believed that people could speak in some other language like that, some strange, unusual language, until 1890 or 1892. It is disputed whether it's 1890 or 1892. That's when Pentecostalism started. Never ever in the history of the church, never ever in any writing or any place else did people ever do that. Why? Because it's not from God. They may be sincere. They may be sincere, but you can be sincerely wrong. And how do we know this? Because every time an angel speaks, every single time an angel speaks in the Bible, it speaks in the language that people can understand. So what was it talking about in 1 Corinthians 13? It was talking about eloquence. Men have a tendency to talk a lot. And angels are very brief. Yes, sure, go ahead, fetus. You're going to have a son. Boom. You know, I mean, they just get right to the point. Men can get so long. In fact, did you know that when Paul preached one time, he preached so long that someone fell asleep and fell out the window and died? You remember that in the book of Acts? Paul's preaching so long, somebody fell asleep. Have you ever found yourself falling asleep when somebody preaches? You may mean well, but your body is like tired, you know. Some of you, like, I knew people who were farmers, and they're out there working all day long, or carpenters, or people out working, and you come into church, and when you go home and you sit in your chair, what happens? Your body says, it's time to sleep. And so so Sunday morning you slept all night, not all night, but maybe you slept some of the night, but you slept, and then you come to church, and what are you doing? You're in the place where your body says it's time to sleep. And so Paul preached. I think he was interesting, but the guy fell asleep, and you know what he did? Paul went out, raised him from the dead, and he continued preaching. I would have taken that as a hint that I was going a bit too long. But they got tired. You know, people get tired. That happens. And here we find that the angels get right to the point. It's eloquence. And these angels and God speak in a language that Abraham can help and understand. And you'll see that because we're going to be looking at angelic encounters right into the Christmas story and then right into the life of Christ and into the New Testament over the next couple of months. So it's each one stands alone, but it gives you an insight into human beings and their contact. So Abraham had Sarah and a servant prepare food. So they got real food. Now that's important to understand. It's real food. I remember I was in church one time when I was growing up, and every once in a while we had an evening service, and they'd have a fellowship with food afterwards. And the pastor said, tonight we're going to have a real feast. I made sure I came back that night. My folks didn't go to church. I decided I'm going to go. Now, I'm going to get there somehow, because when they have food, it's really good. And I got there, and there was no food. I thought, what happened? How come there's no food? And I even asked the pastor afterwards. He says, well, I meant a real feast on the Word of God. That doesn't work for a teenager, okay? And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Where's the refreshments, okay? So this isn't like something symbolic. Just sit under the tree there, and the angels just kind of made believe they're eating. No, Sarah goes and she prepares food. And in verse 8, it makes it very clear. He took it, they prepared them under the tree, and they did eat. They did eat. Did you know after Jesus, while Jesus was alive, he ate? And after he died and rose from the dead and appeared unto the disciples, he was actually walking down a road, met a couple of them. He met actually his uncle, or it was his aunt's husband, and another person, and they're walking down the road, and they don't recognize him at first, and he starts talking about the Bible, and they sit down, and when they go to eat, they sit down to eat together. All of a sudden, they recognize it's Jesus. And here, the angel and Abraham ate. So you may think, well, yeah, I met this person, I didn't know who they were, but they ate, so they can't be an angel. Oh, really? It says some have entertained angels unaware. Some even sat down and ate with them. You may have sat down and had a meal with an angel. It'd be a stranger, somebody you didn't know, something God was doing in your life. And God's timing is unique. Robert, we've been praying for someone who hasn't been out in church for a while, and we prayed and tried to find them this week, and Robert wanted to go trick-or-treating with them. He's 16, but he wanted to go trick-or-treating. I said, you can go if you dress up. You ever remember teenagers come to your house and not dressed up, right? He wanted to go, and you won't believe the timing. We just happened to go somewhere, and we went here, we went there, and then we said, okay, I have something I have to return to Amazon at Kohl's. Did you know that you don't have to return something from Amazon to Amazon? You go to Kohl's. Who knew that? And we walk into Kohl's, and who's sitting there? The person we're looking for. Right there. It was like, wow, that was God's timing. And then 2 days later, we're heading up to Wingdale to pick up some plywood. I'm planning on trying to make an outdoor nativities thing here, a silhouette type thing, and just something to look nice, and trying to find people that were given some plywood, and Robert and I, and all of a sudden we turn on this side road, and at that moment, almost walking off the side road, is another person that we prayed for and haven't seen for a whole year and a half. Someone we're praying for, and there they are. Now, that's not an angel, but that's God's timing. And sometimes in God's timing, he might bring someone into your life to help you to do something. I was with a friend one time, and we went to this, we drove up the Taconic Parkway. We were living in Norwalk. We drove all the way up Taconic Parkway to go to this youth camp thing, and they had a great meeting, and we were singing, and we're talking to people about the Lord, and they didn't have refreshments. They didn't have food. Almost all those things had food. And we're on our way back, and we're like, we can't get anywhere. Nothing's open back at that time. And so we found a gas station that was closed, and there was a soda machine there. And neither of us had enough change. And we said, God, we prayed, said, Lord, please help us get something. We're hungry, we're thirsty. And a pickup truck came, driving down the road. Guy got out, he says, you guys need some change? We said, yep. He handed us enough money to buy 2 sodas, got back in his car, and drove the other way. It might have been a man. It might have been a human. Looked just like a man. It was a real car. Personally, I think when I get to heaven, I'm going to find out that was an angel. And who knows, in your life, you're stuck by the side of the road, your car broke down, someone stops and helps you. They may look like a human being. They may talk like a human. They may eat like a human. Now, if they're doing something that's immoral or ungodly, it's not the good kind of angel. But so here they eat, and Sarah prepares the food. And then they ask this question, where is Sarah? Whoa. Imagine if some stranger comes and, hey, how you doing? Hey, hanging out. And then they say, and they mention your wife. How's your wife? How's Alexandra? Whoa. You go, whoa, huh? How, what? How, huh? How's Becky? What? You'd be like, whoa. Okay. They knew about her, and they said, where is she? We read the passage already. And God says, verse 10, he says, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. Now, see, God had promised that they were going to have a child, but never put a time frame on it. Now all of a sudden God puts a time frame on the thing. And what happened? It made it very clear that they were past childbearing age. In verse 11 it says they were well stricken in age, both of them. They're not going to have kids. And what was Sarah's response? In verse 12, she laughed within herself. It doesn't say she laughed outside. She laughed within herself. She's like, Why? Why did she laugh? She didn't laugh out loud, but it was lack of faith in God's promise and power. Have you ever come to the point where you're so discouraged enough that when you hear one of God's promises, instead of claiming it, you laugh and say, God can't do that for me? I've waited and waited. Nothing happened. We expect instantaneous answers to prayer. We expect instantaneous blessing. I'm sick, heal me instantly. God doesn't always do that. That's one of the things they did in The Chosen, I think, was very well. They took artistic license with certain things, and one of the disciples, they have him crippled. And God had sent them to go out and heal other people. And his name's James, and he says to Jesus, he said, I don't feel right doing this. And Jesus said, what do you mean? He said, well, how can I tell people that you heal them when I'm like this? And again, this is not in the Bible, but boy, the way they dealt with it was really good. Jesus says to him, what you have is a gift. And there will be a time when you're going to be whole. But when they see that you believe me, even in the state that you're in, how much more will they believe? And so God sometimes doesn't fulfill promises immediately the way that we think. And what happens? We get discouraged. And imagine being Sarah. You're going to have a child. She got so desperate. She let another woman sleep with her husband to have that child. That's how desperate she was. And then there was conflict. And she's had a rough life. And so here comes God talking to him. And he says, I will visit you. There's not an angel talking. One of them's God. He says, I'm going to do this for you, and I'm going to fulfill. I told you this, and I'm going to fulfill the promise. And she laughs within herself. And then says, and the Lord said unto Abraham, whoops, right, there is his name, the Lord. He's talking. One of them's God appearing. And he said to them, wherefore did Sarah laugh? He says, why did she laugh? So he knew what Sarah thought. And he asked why she laughed. He knew that it was a lack of faith. And his response to this in verse 14 is a great verse, which sometimes we need to remember. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for God? No. I don't know what you're facing, what difficulty, what challenges. Nothing's too hard for God. God can change you. God can change the person giving you a difficult time. God can change the situation that you're in. He may not do it immediately. You may have to wait like Sarah. You may have to wait like Abraham. You may have to leave your home and family to be someplace else, to be alone for a long period of time in a tent. And God says, I'm going to fulfill that promise. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And as a result of that, it says in verse 15, Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not. Now, she could be honest. I didn't really laugh, but I laughed inside of myself. It could be one of those play on word things. But she basically lied directly to God. It says, for she was afraid. Are you afraid that you don't have enough faith? Sometimes. Are you? Are you afraid to talk to God because you don't believe? The disciples said this, I believe, help thou my unbelief. You don't have to have perfect faith to do something for God. In fact, after living 3 years with Christ, watching him die, seeing him risen from the dead, he meets with his disciples on the hill right before he leaves, and it said they worshiped him. This is Matthew 28, and then it says, but some doubted. They still were like, You won't have perfect faith. But God can use you. And so God actually had to rebuke her. He said, yeah, no, you did. You did. And then in verse 16, the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom. They looked toward Sodom. We're going to look at a lot more detail about Sodom next week. But they're heading to Sodom for a reason. Some of you may be familiar with what happened to Sodom. And God's about to leave, and then he's talking with the angels, and he says to them, and you say, why do you call them angels? It never says they're angels right here. The next chapter it does. Okay, next chapter makes it real clear these two guys are angels. So he's talking to he actually uses the word. Doesn't use it in this chapter, but describes them. And God decided to tell Abraham what he planned to do. He decided to tell him what he planned to do. In verse 20 it says, and the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it which has come to me. And if not, I will know. And they turned from hence and started to go to Sodom. Okay, these people's sin was so bad that people were crying out to heaven for help. They were so bad that people were crying to heaven for help. God knew in heaven how awful this was. We like to say there's a little bit of good in each of us. That's the problem. There's a little bit of good in each of us. But all of us are sinners, and we have a sinful nature. And we need to realize that people will do evil things. Can you imagine? Look at what Hamas did in Israel. I mean, someone described the other night, one of the Israeli defense ministers, what they came upon. And the autocracies that were committed. I mean, we know that they beheaded babies and children and women, but there were even worse things. So how can there be worse things? There were worse things than that they did. How can such a thing like that happen? How could people be so evil? And the evil in Sodom was crying out to God. And God did not say, isn't this interesting? He says, I'm going to go see for myself. I'm going to go see for myself. Now, God knows. But in a sense, he's kind of giving them a chance. They're going to go down there where the people are and see what's going on. Here's an interesting thing. It does not say God's going to judge them. God didn't say, I'm going to see, and if they're bad, I'm going to zap them. No, didn't say anything like that. He just said, I'm going to go and see. Now, Abraham's nephew, Lot, lived in Sodom. And in verse 23, after God said that, when they turned on their way, Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Abraham knew that once God saw what's going on in Sodom in person, there was no way he could allow it to go on. There comes a point where God stops the wicked people. He stops the Genghis Khans. He stops the Adolf Hitlers. He stops the Stalins. He stops the Maos. He stops the people that are doing these awful things. And Abraham knows this and he recognizes this. Those people haven't even come yet, but he realizes God is going to have to judge them. And so he interceded and negotiated with God. Have you ever cared for people so much that you did that? Here's an evil city. And so Abraham says, Peradventure there be 50 righteous men within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? So could you imagine that? You have a big city that's just full of wickedness. And you say, God, look, if there's just 50 righteous people, will you save the rest of the city? And God's response was, that be it, he says, and the Lord said, if I find in Sodom, verse 26, 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. If just 50 righteous people are in that city of thousands and thousands and thousands, he said, I'll spare the whole city. Well, that seems pretty good, right? You got to have at least 50 people righteous in there. And verse 27, and Abraham answered and said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all this city for the lack of 5? And he said, that's God. If I find there 45, I'll not destroy it. And then down in verse 29, he says, what if there's 40? God says, no, okay. And then verse 30, what if there's 30? God says, okay, I'll spare the city for the 30. Then in verse 31, he says, what if 20? God says, yes. And then finally in verse 32, he said, what if there's 10? Just 10. Now we know, and we're going to look at next week, that Abraham's nephew had at least 4 daughters, at least, and at least 2 son-in-laws and his wife. That's the minimum. If you add that up, that's 10. We're going to find out next week, were there 10? Were there? So here, Abraham, a man who God gave promises to, who's living out in the desert, God comes and sits down with and eats with. You never know who, if you entertain a stranger, who you might be reaching out to. And what God is going to do in your life. But God is going to fulfill the promises. And even though sometimes you won't see them right away, even though you haven't seen it yet, God's going to do something wonderful in your life if you allow him to and you be patient. And he may just send angels away. Heavenly Father, thank you for the teaching that we learned from Abraham's encounter with you and with 2 of those angels. Help us to be sensitive and aware and to reach out and to care, to be patient for the promises and to trust you even though we haven't seen some of the answers we're looking for, to know that you're going to do it.